it is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Christopher Korten. Now, Christopher is an American academic with a passion for history, language, and education. He studied history at Oxford and Cambridge universities, so playing both sides of the boat race there, before embarking on a career as a university professor. His passion for the English language and teaching has resulted in over 850,000 followers on Instagram, and I'm sure we've got quite a few of those in the room today. His account is dedicated to exploring all aspects of the English language, offering valuable insights and resources for learners and educators alike. Professor Korten's unique blend of expertise and communication skills has made him an influential figure in academia and social media, and it is my absolute pleasure to welcome him to the stage today. So, over to you. The stage is yours.
Charlotte, thank you very much, and welcome everyone. I'm excited to spend the next 60 minutes with all of you as we contemplate how we can pack more information, more useful information into our lessons. And what I'm going to suggest today is that there are ways that we can incorporate cultural competence, cultural knowledge into the conversations and discussions and speeches of our students. And I'm going to move the slide. And the key question for today, just to keep us on the same page, this is the question that I endeavor to answer. How can teachers most successfully implement cultural awareness, cultural knowledge into the classroom and into students' discussions? Now, if you have any questions along the way, Charlotte and company will be studiously noting those, and then hopefully we'll be able to answer as many of those questions. And just a note for Charlotte, if there's something sort of timely, we can address them even during the conversation or during this presentation, as well as, of course, at the end. Now, before we get started, what does this cultural competence mean, or cultural knowledge? It's an individual's ability to deal effectively in situations characterized by cultural diversity. When you travel abroad or go to an unfamiliar place and you're not sure the cultural norms, how you should act. I want to give you one interesting example that happened to me when I first got to Poland. I arrived to Poland. I didn't know Polish, and I didn't know the cultural customs of the country. And I'll never forget, I was at a restaurant and I'd finished my drink, and the waitress came over and asked me in broken English if I would like another drink. And I said, thank you. And then I waited and I waited and I waited. Now, meanwhile, she passed the table 3 or 4 times smiling at me, but refused to get my drink. And I was offended. I thought that this was something, directed at me personally. And what I later found out is that thank you in Polish means no. But where I come from, thank you means yes, please. I would like another drink. And so these sorts of cultural, now this is rather innocuous. Innocuous means not very serious, harmless of sorts, but it plays a bigger role when we're talking about young people that you're teaching who are traveling abroad. These impressions, especially the negative ones, can have an can affect them unduly. They can have a really serious sort of psychological issue and sort of, become less talkative, sort of withdraw. And so what we want to do today is just sort of remind you, or I'm going to suggest reasons why this topic is super important, and then show you why it's super applicable to your students and their progress. Now, why is this important? I've already given you an example on a personal level why it's important. It would have saved me 1 hour of misunderstanding, and honestly, a little bit, I was a bit offended. So I would have known not to be. But why do we want to teach cultural competence in the classroom? It adds value to the course and to your reputation. Now, it's so what we're suggesting is that we want to teach more than just the language itself. We want to add another layer on top of it, which I'll get to in just a second. The second reason cultural competence is important is that it prepares students for international opportunities. Those opportunities can take the form of studies, an exchange program, or more seriously, or just as seriously, a job, an international job. And then finally, this cultural competence has been linked to linguistic competence. In other words, you tend to speak better if you know more about the culture. Now, this what I'm talking about today follows a long or a general trend that's been underway for the last 2 or 3 decades. It's not new, but it's becoming more refined on how to add value on top of the grammar, on top of the speaking and general discussions that you're having in the classroom. And it comes in more or less four forms. And I'm going to talk about the first one, cultural competence, but we also have soft skills, this ability to deal with people effectively. And, we can add that sort of, set of skills, these soft skills, to our communication tasks. We're not going to do that today, but we could. Psychological well-being, how to stay psychologically grounded in different sort of tense situations that I mentioned earlier about misunderstandings. And then finally, just general global competence about politics, about geography, and what's going on in the world. All right. Now, as a teacher, and I'm going to be talking to teachers. If you're a student, I want you to sort of reverse the roles for a minute and think as a teacher. I'm going to ask, the first thing we have to ask are the right questions. We have to ask questions that lead us to discussions of cultural competence. So let me give you a few examples. Now, these examples are meant to sort of catalyze or sort of help you think of questions in your own context, because we're going to take some of those questions later. If you don't see a clear path to teaching cultural competence in your situation, I want you to drop a question into the chat box, and I'm going to help unlock the mystery. So let's say you're teaching Kazakh teens. I was just in Kazakhstan. Love that experience. Or let's say you're teaching Polish business people, adults, male and female, or you're teaching Indian medical students who are planning to study or are studying in Lithuania. So we have 3 very different scenarios. Now, I know a lot of you teach high school and lower. We're going to get to those. If you teach 5 and 6 and 7-year-olds, stay tuned, because this is relevant for you too. And I'm going to show you how it is if you'll ask a question. So if I'm teaching Kazakh teens and I want to teach not just conversation, not just grammar, but not just conversation, but how, a little bit more than that, then I might ask them leading questions. All right, where do you plan to travel this summer? Where do you want to study after high school? And make notes. Find out where they're going. Now, I know in the Kazakh case, because I did some research, students go to Europe, but they go to Turkey, a lot in Turkey, a few to China and South Korea. But let's say we take the European example. And most students, I didn't know this, but Kazakh students love to go to Italy. They love to go to Italy. And if they go to Italy, they speak Italian. So this is a way then that we can sort of identify and begin to prepare that discussion. Business people, it's the same question. Where do you do business? In which industries? Then we prepare. Now, I want to say this straight away because I know some of you are asking, Professor, I don't know anything about Italy. I've never been there. How can I teach my students cultural competence when I'm not competent? Well, We have the internet. And so what I'm going to suggest is it's not incumbent upon you. It's not necessary that you have all the answers. It's necessary that you ask the right questions, and then you can find out all the answers online. And I'm going to give you a few examples to go with. So let's say you're teaching the medical students. And we have this, Indians tend to have a hierarchical structure. Students are deferential. They give respect to the elders. So the teachers occupy this, unassailable position where they're always right. But in Europe, it's more equal. You can challenge or ask professors more directly about their ideas. Or if you disagree, you can even mention that. It's accepted. So this is a cultural difference that if you want to prepare your students well, you can start to acculturate them. You can start to get them familiar with the new culture by talking about these differences. So we would. For example, here, an Indian student at the medical university might be, again, very deferential, filled with respect. Thank you for your advice, doctor. I trust your judgment. Whereas the Lithuanian student or the Lithuanian context at the medical university, I have some questions about my treatment. Now this is from the patient's perspective, but also from the student's perspective. Is there another way to treat this disease or illness? I think maybe there's a better way, or maybe we could try this, or, challenging or, suggesting alternative ideas are things that are commonplace, that are welcome in Europe. And so this is what I mean by acculturation. We're practicing the language, but at the same time, we're asking different questions, or we're asking questions. We're not just saying thank you for the answer. So I think this is really interesting in terms of a role play. So we can do these role plays where you have, your Indian students, and then someone can play the Lithuanian doctor or the teacher. And there you start to break the ice, to initiate that cultural exchange before they get there and encounter the shock. And this is one of the things I want to share with you. If you can tip your students off to the main cultural differences, the shock on the ground means when they actually arrive to that location is less. And the less the shock, the better it is, because shocks can traumatize students. If they have a big cultural shock, it can actually have an adverse effect. Adverse is negative. Kazakh teens traveling to France. Now, I don't want to offend any of the French speakers here, but if you've been to Central France, you might, excuse me, let me go the other way. If you go to Kazakhstan and you speak English, I can tell you that the people there are beholden to you as an English speaker. They hold you in high esteem, and they endeavor to try to communicate on your level. And this is really heartening. It's a very warm sort of welcome. There's nothing shocking about this. I hope that this is going through. I see that there's a few questions about the connection. I hope there's no connection problem. But when we go to, if we have the Kazakh people going to France, of course, let's assume we're communicating in English and we don't know the French. So here's what we can suggest to them. We can say, so here's the cue card. You're in France and a foreign tourist asks you for directions in English. A French person who knows some English but prefers French. So it's the opposite of the Kazakh, who will try to make an effort. But the French, especially in the center of Paris, might rather want to speak French. So they might politely respond in French first. Knowing this and teaching it to your students will lessen the shock, and they won't feel offended as much as they would if they didn't know this was coming. And so eventually they'll switch to English if the tourist struggles, but they make sure to convey their preferences. So they much prefer to speak French. So what's a strategy around this? Here's one as an example, just to sort of give you could teach the students 3 French words that work really well. Start with these, and then you can switch to English. Bonjour, Je voudrais a glass of water, please. And so you can say s'il vous plaît at the end, please. But the point is, you start with French, you glide into English, and somehow that will soften the reaction you're going to get from the French. I know this firsthand. But the point is that you have anticipated the cultural differences. This, as a teacher, is what you want to do. Remember earlier I said it adds value? It adds value to your course, to your reputation, because you can go to the parents, to the students, or to the adults who are in the class and say, listen, not only did we talk about first conditional, or not only did you have an interesting speaking session, but we also understand how better to engage the French, at least French waiters and waitresses, when we arrive to France. And so we have more than just language that we're providing them. And whenever you add value, it adds to the offer of your course. It adds to the offer that you provide as a teacher. The more interesting, the more attractive the offer, the more students come your way. I'm a big proponent of selling this, and I'm going to talk about selling it later. But let me tell you, if students aren't prepared. Now, listen, I have been in many countries for the first time. I've lived in Italy. I've lived in Germany. I've lived in France and Russia and Poland. And I told you about a shock earlier. When there is a disconnect culturally, you just stop, you close and you close up. This, for young people, can have a very serious, or we have a big word here, deleterious effect. Deleterious is a very negative effect on their psyche, on their confidence. And when students who are already vulnerable in a new culture lose confidence, they are not going to talk. So this helps them, sort of get acclimated before they even arrive. All right. These negative feelings, as I said, are very real. I've had many of them, and they produce negative consequences in your speaking. So now what I want to do, I just want to, I want to ask if you have any questions. We've got more to discuss here, but if you have any questions that you'd like to bring up in your situation, how can I teach cultural competence in this class, in my class? So I'll give you, something. Well, let me wait and see if we have any.
There are a few questions in the Q&A box already if you wanted to have a look.
I see.
There,
I didn't catch that.
So there are some going into the public chat, of course, but there are some that have already been moved. So feel free to have a look.
All right. So Vanya asks a very perceptive question. And the question is, do you think we could fall in the trap of instilling stereotypes? And Vanya is obviously referring to my French stereotype earlier. And I think you have to use your good judgment. Now, if you haven't traveled a lot, then you can stick very closely to sort of linguistic, cultural issues. You don't have to move very far into the stereotypes generally. I've been to these countries, so I feel I can speak quite confidently on it in my own experience. Obviously, all sorts of cultural differences in some ways when they're pronounced could be considered stereotypes. But I think in this case with young people, we can let them know, listen, this doesn't apply to everybody, but you might encounter this. We can leaven it. We can sort of qualify it as we teach it. We don't have to teach in absolutes. We can say, if you encounter this, don't be worried. It happens to everyone, or it happens to a lot of people. Maybe not everyone, but it happens to a lot of people. And just be aware that, you don't need to be offended by this. So Vanya, very great question. I'm not sure if we have other ones here. Let me check. Now, this is very interesting. And I think this is now, so Maria de los Angeles has asked the question, how to teach cultural competence in a class of students who won't get many chances to go abroad. Now, honestly, this is where I would use my own common sense. If I sense that my students aren't going to be traveling so much, I don't think, very honestly speaking, unless you live in a very big city where you have certain tourists from certain areas coming, I'm not sure cultural competence is what you need to be teaching. You know what would be more interesting? Soft skills. Everyone needs to work in groups. Everyone needs to work with people. And so you can incorporate that. You can deal with negotiation or how to deal with people who, have major disagreements. You can talk about these sorts of things, tone of questions. So you don't have to talk about things that you don't think are relevant. And if your students aren't traveling or going to engage in this, I don't see a point. There's not much to sell to the parents and the students that is relevant. And the point of all of this extra value on top of the language is to show, in my view, to show immediate relevance. Not relevance in 5 years. Students, especially the younger they are, the less excited they are about things that aren't immediately relevant. If they're going to France or if they're going to Italy next month, and I say, listen, we're going to talk about Italy and some of the things you might encounter. One of the first things I would talk about is how I would play YouTube video. I have one at the end here where I would talk about, the Italian English accent. We'd play some of these and say, what words didn't you understand? And you know what? Everyone's going to be engaged because in 3 weeks, they're going to be in Italy. So I think relevance plays a role here. Now, the younger they are, I don't think you have to sell them on this is important for your future. I just think you incorporate it. You sell the parents, but you don't have to sell the kids this yet. You just do it. So, for example, little kids, maybe we can teach them the skill of map reading as we do directions, prepositions of direction and things. All right. So Anita has mentioned stereotypes as well. Now, I want to say that, first of all, these cultural things, as a historian, we talk about things that are controversial. And just because some of these things aren't absolutely true doesn't mean you can't talk about them if they're likely to experience it. It doesn't mean you have to say this is always true. You can always qualify your statements by saying this can happen. This is a possibility, so you have to be aware. And obviously, everyone's different. And obviously, there are differences between big cities and small towns. But again, I want to tell you from my own experiences traveling, if you're not familiar with some of the basic cultural or mentalities of the culture, you can have big setbacks in your transition, as I did. If somebody would have sort of addressed some of these things, it would have saved me a lot of time and a lot more heartache. All right. Should I integrate students' own cultural aspects? I think it's great if we can draw on their experiences in the classroom and bring it in. It makes it more real because these are their contemporaries. I think that's very helpful. All right. I'm going to move back to we'll get to some questions a little bit later. I want to move back to this here. All right, so I'm going to a third example. You have or a fourth example: Ukrainian students studying in Germany, or anyone coming into Germany. I think different things you can address that I would consider cultural, obviously educational as well, but cultural issues of the importance and types of exams. Some of these are different. I remember when I first came to Poland, it was an oral exam. You had one-on-one oral exams where it was just you picked a question out of a bowl. So, different types of exam formats are very, can be very intimidating. I remember in Cambridge, we had set 3-hour exams. In America, I never had 3-hour exams where the one grade is those 3 hours. And, if you're prepared for that, you do a lot better than if it sort of hits you and not prepared. So these sorts of things are really important. Types of exams and assessment, I think, are really critical. It can affect you. It affected a lot of people at Cambridge who aren't used to the all or nothing 3 hours at the end of a whole semester course or term course. Views of cheating, I think you have to address. Cheating is everywhere. It's an issue. I deal with it as a professor, but how do different countries view it? Again, you could say we're stereotyping, but there are differences from country to country. And I think you have to talk about some of these things. You can't just say that every teacher is different, or there's no real value that you're not giving them a heads up on the possible problems. Attendance, in some countries it's mandatory. Others, it's not mandatory. The way you dress in America, you can go in your pajamas. You would never do that in Europe. In most of my experiences, or in any part of the world, really. In the US, you can go in your pajamas to university and it's sort of accepted. That's a big shock if you're going over there. How you interact with faculty. The Americans tend to be very folksy, F-O-L-K-S-Y, very sort of, they flatten the hierarchy as such. If you go to the further east, maybe in India and China, there's a lot of deference given to those in positions of authority. So how you deal and talk with a teacher, these are really important things that you want to discuss with your kids that are going over there. How you address the teacher. Is it professor? Is it by the first name? These are big things. If you make a mistake, it's not the end of the world, but it can cause a bit of embarrassment if you get it wrong. All right, so here's a key idea. The most interesting discussion questions, and right now we're talking about speaking, the most interesting discussion questions revolve around the differences, not necessarily the commonalities, but the differences with one's home culture. And so the goal as a teacher, if you want to keep things lively, if you want to get students involved and keep them involved and they're going to go, wow, it's focusing on the differences, asking leading questions that result in differences, like the view of tests. If you know that the view of tests is very different, or the format, these are discussions that kids are going to want to engage in, especially if they're going there in a month or 2 months or next semester. So the differences I would focus on. They tend to remember it more. They tend to be more engaged and want to talk or at least listen. All right. Now, teaching cultural intelligence works most naturally with speaking activities, but it can also be incorporated into other key ESL areas. And so let's take a look at that. So we can do grammar focus. Now, this is cultural. Let's say you're going to the UK and you're teaching prepositions of place. You can teach how the roads and signs and paths are in England. If you've been to England and you're used to doing things on the right side, this will be quite a shock. So on the left side in England, people drive on the left side of the road. So not only are you using or learning prepositions of place, but you're learning about English culture. In this case, the roads and how to navigate in England. At a roundabout in America, it's not a roundabout. We don't have roundabouts, really. We have intersections with lights, but in the UK, there's a lot of roundabouts. When driving in the UK, you must give way to cars coming from your right when you're at a roundabout. And so we're learning prepositions as we learn about signage and ways to navigate in the UK. And when would I do this? I would do this with students who are A, learning prepositions of place, and B, about to embark on a trip to the UK. All right. Let's do another thing, and then we're gonna have plenty of time for questions. I want to take up this a few of the questions. We've got a lot here in the chat. The more culturally aware your students are, the more favorable reception they receive in the foreign culture. I want to say that one more time. The more culturally aware your students are, the more favorable the reception they receive in the foreign culture. I'm going to give you one example. And this is an example that can work in every country. And it's really interesting. And it's an icebreaker for your students that can really help them to bond with those in the other country. So, for example, fun icebreakers everywhere are to sort of remember or know one or two really funny phrases or notoriously difficult phrases in that target country. So, for example, in Polish, there's an expression brzmi dobrze. It's just funny to sound for anyone English speaking. And if you know this phrase, first of all, they'll be shocked. But secondly, they will immediately start to laugh because no one knows this, but it's a very funny phrase. Brzmi means it sounds like. Brzmi dobrze, it sounds okay, it sounds good. And likewise, on the American or the English side, heebie-jeebies is quite a funny phrase. It just has a funny sound to it. Gives me the heebie-jeebies. It's scary. So the point is, when someone taps into your local language or your local culture and provides some knowledge that you didn't expect, not just hello, which is what most people come with, but something a little bit below the surface, it immediately helps them bond. It's a great hack to getting closer relationships rather quickly, is to do something light like this, and every student can memorize one phrase, and then they have something to talk about. And once you break the ice, then you can sort of start to have a more interesting conversation. Another hack that I think is really interesting, knowing words of local food. So if you go to Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan or Kyrgyzstan, and you know beshbarmak or mante or plof, and you mention this and you say, when are we going to eat mante, or when are we going to have beshbarmak? Your host, your friend will immediately start to smile, because these are cuisines that are near and dear to their heart. You break down the boundaries and they're more open. They accept you because you have tapped into something that means a lot to their culture. And food, and these three in particular, mean a lot to these three cultures. And I think it's a great way to sort of have your students sort of develop close relationships rather quickly. All right, now I want to talk about the cell here. And now this is, I think, quite important. It's not, obviously, the most important thing, and if we want to just remember, the most important thing is we're teaching them English. There's a second layer that I've suggested we want to add on top, which is to develop a bit of cultural wherewithal, a bit of cultural intelligence on, the target country, the place we're going to be visiting or doing business in. Now, getting back to selling and promoting, what I'm suggesting is that we can sell and promote this as a teacher. We can say to the parent of students, listen, we've learned the grammar, or this particular grammar aspect. We practice language, but I've also, while doing that, helped them prepare for their trip to Europe this summer. We covered these three things. Some cultural issues that they are likely to encounter. Parents love this. They see added value. When you tell the students this who are about to go on the trip, they also see the value of this. The more value you pack into the lesson, the better that program, that lesson is. And guess what? The more they talk about it, your reputation grows. And so this is about, obviously, the students, but it's also about the teacher and the reputation of developing, exceeding expectations, moving beyond what is considered the norm or the standards, and equipping them in ways that previously, in previous generations, we didn't think about. Now I want to get to the questions. And now, if anyone has a specific stereotype that they're concerned about, I would love if you bring it up. We can raise it and talk about it. So I'm going to try to answer questions that deal not just with cultural differences, but deal with culture, how to teach cultural differences in the classroom of a discussion or a speaking class. This is, I think, most interesting because, again, we want to... Okay, let's look at this here. We have Naval, I'm teaching ICC to students of tourism. How can I manage to incorporate it? I might need a little bit. Naval, can you explain exactly what you mean by that?
Intercultural competence, I think, is referring to there.
Yeah, but incorporated, it seems quite a natural marriage with tourism. So I'm not quite sure what the issue is. I mean, tourism deals extensively with other countries. So I'm not quite sure exactly what the issue would be there. So if you could give a little bit more specifics, it seems um, that that is quite naturally lends itself to intercultural competence. Ah, this is interesting. How to explain, Lisa asks, how to explain what is polite in their culture versus theirs if you don't have their language and they are low level English learners. So when you say if they don't have their language, you mean if you don't know, for example, German, how to teach what is polite? Well, um, I think you have to find out some of these things online if you've not been there. I mean, we have the internet. This is going to be for teachers as a resource. This is our best friend, and we know a lot of us are familiar with Chat GPT and how these can give more pointed answers. But I think we have to so we have to sort of prepare in that way if we don't know the target language. And if they're low levels of English, we only teach to their level. So if they, if they're 5 and 6 year olds, then we don't teach sophisticated manners of style or cultural etiquette because they're just not prepared for that. Neither would they be prepared in their own culture. So I think we have to use sort of, be realistic and use some common sense with that. And so we can only teach what they're able to sort of communicate. And so that's the level. I don't think we can go beyond that. At least I'm not sure I would try to go beyond that. So if they're very basic learners, A1 plus or A2, I would focus a lot on greetings, a lot on how to be thankful, when to show your appreciation. So there are certain sort of common points that we have to sort of discuss. So greetings and goodbyes are really critical. You want to get those right. How do they do it in another country? Some people shake hands, some people kiss, other people don't touch at all. So going through some of that, I think, is important. How to say goodbye, how to thank people when you've been invited for dinner or something, these sorts of things. And in what way do you thank people? Do you bring flowers or wine, or do you say thank you? Do you use words? So basic issues you can teach at the A1 plus level. Now we're not finished yet, so let me go back here. Although I will just say, for those of you who want to continue some of these conversations, we won't have a chance to finish all of it, although we have quite some time for more questions. The QR code there is my Instagram, but I'm also found on LinkedIn, and there's my email. I'm happy to further some of these conversations. I'm from Germany. How can I? So this is a Mechtild. I'm from Germany. How can I explain to German students that not every country has this very direct way of giving feedback? Well, since we're in the context of an English-speaking class, this is English conversation, I would show it syntactically. I would show it with word order. I would be direct in that way. I would say, okay, in Germany, you might say it what way? And they would answer the way they would normally say it. And then I would show the target language how they would say it. And if you go to Japan or some of these countries, they're very much indirect if it has a negative consequence. So 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 you would just say it. So instead of saying I don't agree, in some cultures, I'm not sure means I don't agree. And so wherever that country is, I think you just compare the sentences and you say, if you get this, it's not guaranteed, but this is a possibility because it's it's an indirect culture. It's possible they don't agree with you. And we don't know because we don't know the context, but I think giving them this parallel sort of universe or cultural universe is very helpful. Ask students how they would behave in specific. Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm hitting the wrong buttons and I want to apologize. I should be scrolling here. All right. Okay, Florencia has asked an interesting question dealing with tipping. Now, tipping is what the money you give after you pay a bill at a restaurant, or maybe what you leave in your hotel room. These are called, or what you give the taxi driver after you pay the bill. There's something known as a tip, TIP, or tipping. And this varies greatly from country to country. And this is a great thing to know, especially for adults, less obviously for kids. So teenagers and preteens, maybe it's not as important, although if their teens are going on their own with their own money, then this becomes an issue as well. But the issue of tipping, what's expected? If you go to Miami, Florida, or New York or Los Angeles, this is true, I've been there. If you go to these cities, and you use a service like restaurants, like taxis, and you don't tip, it is, I can tell you, it's not only offensive, but you will hear verbal feedback. It could get aggressive verbally, not physically, hopefully. But it's a very sort of, it's a shock. And you know what's even more shocking? Where I come from, 10 or 15% is okay, but in Miami, it's 20, 25%. If you give 15, it's like a slap on the face, like your service was bad. And so this is an issue. People can get offended by that. So yeah, that's an interesting thing and again, you as a teacher don't need to know these details. You can find them out, but knowing to ask that question is something that I think this is our responsibility. What are my students most likely to encounter? I ask myself, I project, they're going there to study. What are they most likely to encounter? Well, the issue of friendships, how you call even the word friend, in the English language, friend means everything. In some languages, we have different levels of friendship, especially in Slavic languages, different levels of friendship. So teaching them on the different levels of friendship. Listen, just because on day one, four people call you their friend, if you're in the United States, it doesn't mean that they're your friend in the word we use in our country. And these sorts of things help save students a lot of face. To save students a lot of face means that it helps them not to get in an embarrassing situation. So this is interesting. Friendship, relationship, money, these are the important things that nearly everyone has to go through, especially if they're teenagers or university students going abroad. These are great things to cover with them. All right. Now, I'm sorry, I keep going to the wrong thing here. All right. So we have a few comments. Wow, there's a lot here. I'm really happy. Now Asma asks, thank you. How can I apply it to children without the danger of changing their mother culture? If they're traveling, I don't think we have to worry about changing their mother culture. If you're just on a holiday, I don't think the cultural enculturation is going to be that comprehensive that you're going to they're going to forget. If they now, it's a different issue if they move countries to a different culture. That is, I think, the decision of the parents, not the teacher. To what degree do they want to become, culturally assimilated into the target country, or their own? And that's something I think parents ultimately should decide. Okay, Gildes asks, do you think it is compulsory to teach college students intercultural communication? What types of topics are better to choose for teaching these subjects? Well, this is interesting. So what we're suggesting basically is a replacement of an intercultural course, obviously not completely and not as comprehensively. But what we are asking of teachers is to begin thinking about how we can incorporate cultural ideas into classrooms where students are going to be traveling abroad, where students are going to be encountering different cultures. So in that sense, intercultural communication classes and strict English classes now need to coordinate better to understand what's being taught in both. And I think that's a very positive discussion, which means that you can cover more ground, and the intercultural communication can obviously focus on things that you can't possibly do in a speaking class. We have a lot of questions. If I've missed a great question, we can go ahead and so. All right. Nettie has asked, whose culture to teach for teaching English as EFL, just to teach them to use English appropriately? Again, I preface this conversation by saying that the immediacy of the target culture is critical. In other words, we need to find out what their needs are. If they're not going to be traveling, or in one case, the students aren't traveling at all outside the country, then I think cultural competence plays less of a role in the classroom. I think soft skills can be elevated, maybe psychological aspects, but I don't think we need to focus on cultural communication if it's not going to be put into practice in the near term. So one thing I've learned about the students, if you don't show immediate application, they immediately have less interest. So when I'm teaching any course, history, writing, research, English, it doesn't matter. I'm always trying to show relevance, not in 5 years, but next month, tomorrow, at the next job interview. Here's why this is important. And so I just spell it out. The reason we're talking about this is because when you go to the States, one of the first things you want to do is make a friend. So let's talk about what the word friend means in the US versus what it means here, as an example.
There's a lovely question here from Fatma, Chris, who asks, tomorrow she's teaching a lesson about table manners around the world. Do you have any suggestions for how she might start her lesson?
I'm just wondering how she's going to end it, Charlotte, because around the world is a lot of world. That's a lot of plates. So let me just say that, first of all, we have to limit what world we're going to talk about. So how do we, now this, again, these sort of qualifying questions are things we have to consciously put into place. So the first thing I thought of when Charlotte mentioned this question is, all right, we're going to have to limit this. So the question becomes, which tables are we going to talk about? Which cuisine, which table manners are we going to talk about? So here's how I would approach it. Let me tell you how I would think about it. I think, okay, all right, where do I live? And where are my students most likely to travel to? But secondly, where are they most likely to travel to that they don't know much about table manners or cultural in general? And then I would choose those. Those are the soft spots. Those are the ones where they're motivated to listen. They're motivated to get involved because A, it's going to happen soon, and B, they don't know anything about it. So we have to ask those questions. One of the things we want to do is narrowly define the cultural scope of what we're going to teach. We can't teach everything. So the broader it is, the less effective it becomes. I'm all for compare and contrast, but there are limits to this. So what I might do is take 1 or 2 target countries that are most interesting. Now, obviously, if kids love Italy, or they're always watching Turkish sort of sitcom or these sort of romance day series or something, then of course we can look at Turkey and Italy. But I pick 2 or 3 countries that I know it's going to resonate with the students or with the adults, and I just will ask them directly, "Where are you going? What cultures interest you?" And they tell me. I just go with that. I don't complicate this. So I will pick our culture, Italy, and Turkey, and then we'll talk about the differences. Now, I know some teachers, including me, I don't know all the differences. So we're going to have to do a little research. ChatGPT, AI now can help us a lot. Give us the 3 big differences between these 3 countries and table manners, and you'll get them right away. So we're not called upon to know the answers as a teacher. We're called upon to ask the right questions, to present a working lesson that students can actually get something out of. If we go too broad, let me tell you what happens. They leave, they're entertained, but they don't remember anything. If you limit it to 3 and you keep comparing these 3, they have a good chance of remembering these differences.
Lovely. There's another question here, which is from Mohammed, who is asking about how they can connect students from different cultural backgrounds in the same classroom.
Oh, wow. Now that is a rare, now that's interesting. If you're fortunate, as I am, to have students from all around the world, I teach Erasmus classes. And when I say Erasmus, I also mean Erasmus Plus. So we have students literally from around the world in these classes. Well, first of all, let me just say something about this. And I think this is going to be a relief for Mohammed and for a lot of teachers. If you have a mixed bag, if you have students from all over the world or from 5 or 6 cultures, you already have an international community. And guess what? They're going to get to know each other. They're going to make friends and they're going to discover these differences. If I'm in that sort of a group, I place less of a premium on teaching cultural competence. The students, through their friendships, through their interaction with their group mates, are going to find these things out on their own. All right. Ilona has a question. Dear Christopher, would you, so Ilona E., what would you say to telling stories that can lead to several funny situations because of cultural differences or making up dialogues based on local culture? I think it's amazing. I'm going to tell you one more story. I told you earlier about Poland where I said thank you, and thank you means no in Polish, and yes in the US. Yes, I'd like another. Would you like another drink? Thank you. In where I come from is yes. In Poland, it's no. Let me tell you another very funny story. Now, I often go to Italy, and I actually do give lectures in Italy. I just gave some recently. But when I first got to Italy, I didn't know Italian. And I'll never forget, I stayed at an Airbnb, and the lady knew I was an academic and I was studying at the Vatican and the Vatican archives. And she took me to an art exhibition of a well-known painter, although I have to say I didn't know him. So it was in Gianicolo, which is a very exclusive and artistic part of Rome. It's so beautiful. And I knew Spanish, but I didn't know any Italian. And she kept saying, Louis, 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 Louis. So I assumed Louis was his name, Louis. Louis, Louis, shortened is Louis. So we get to this big event, and he's, there are hundreds of people. So he's obviously very important. There's a big banner. And I went up to him and I said, Louis, it's very nice to meet you. He said, thank you. It's nice to meet you too. My name's Tom. And, the fact that his name was already up there, I misunderstood. Louis is him. It's a pronoun in Italian. I think telling stories like this are great because people laugh. They understand that it's not so serious, and it lets people know, listen, we're going to make mistakes. If you can turn this into something of a learning moment that you can laugh at yourself, you're not going to be perfect. You're going to make mistakes. Students, I think, can benefit from that if it's lighthearted. My concern when I'm teaching or dealing with students who are going to make these trips is not these lighthearted mistakes, it's the more serious ones. But I love telling stories. 2 reasons. Now, we don't like telling stories if it's a student conversation, but if we want to introduce the topic, I think a story at the beginning can be quite appropriate, sort of get them laughing and in the mood. But ultimately, if we're teaching conversation, we want students to do most of the talking. I think we have time for 1 or 2 more. Charlotte, what's
Yeah. I saw a lovely one.
okay,
where was it? I've lost my thing. It's so funny. You distracted me because it was making me giggle about my own similar Louis story.
Let's share it. We're all ears, Charlotte.
I was learning Turkish, but I'd moved there as a teacher, and I would hear people talking, and I'd hear the word Jackson, Jackson, Jackson all the time. I thought people in Turkey were just obsessed with Michael Jackson, but Jackson in Turkish is the future ending of a sentence for future you. Absolutely cracked me up. So one last question then from David, who asks, can learners' culture be related to literature?
One more time. Can learners culture?
Well, can learning cultures, etc.,
Oh,
be
I
done
see.
through literature? I think is the question there.
Well, the short answer is yes, but the longer answer is yes, however. Because this is a lot more complicated. Now, reading literature and gleaning things from it culturally and historically and linguistically is a beautiful thing. Expecting that of your students who are going to travel to, reading Dostoevsky and going to traveling, um, might not work so well. In other words, the transference, it's just, let me tell you the issue. Let me get right to the point. It's hard for students to see the direct transfer and what they can pull out and apply to, once they arrive to the airport. So if you're going to teach through literature, you have to you can do it, but you have to be very prepared. There's a lot of cultural issues that are beautiful to talk about in an abstract sense, but are very difficult to put into application. And one of the things that I think the things about English that we all should recognize is it's practical. We use it when we move. I mean, we're using it for our jobs and our studies and everywhere we travel. And so when we're doing cultural literature, we're going to have to road sign, give them clear road signs on, look at that moment right there. That is a clear indication of how these people think in that situation. So if you find yourself in that situation when you're there, remember that that's a different reaction to what yours is going to be. You can teach literature, but you're going to have to hold them by the hand and be very direct. They're not going to pick it up otherwise.
Thank you so much.